How do you deter insects from eating all of your valuable food crops in the garden? Naturally, without chemicals, without pesticides. There is ways that have been passed down and that work in the garden, and I'm going to share them in this video. The first couple of tips and strategies all revolve around companion planting. So a very famous example of companion planting is to plant leeks next to carrots, because the smell of the leeks deters the carrot fly. Insects are really led by smells, and they find what they really crave and what they need to eat, which is not what you want them to eat, through following scents. So we can manipulate that by planting very strongly scented plants in the garden beds. You can interplant them, you can have them all over your garden. But another really good idea is to figure out where the wind comes from, generally. So here where I am in Nairobi, the wind usually comes from the east or from the southeast, which is actually right behind me. So it comes from there. So let me switch the camera. Now we are looking into the garden, following the direction of the wind. So where I'm standing right now, I would want to plant a lot of strongly scented plants like the borage, wormwood, a lot of ginger, and then also working with a lot of the lemony plants, because a lot of insects, they don't like that lemony smell. So citronella, lemongrass, lemon verbena, and planting them upwind ensures that the wind carries those scents into the garden beds, and that confuses the insects. So that's the first strategy, working with scent masking plants. Now the second strategy is also coming from the arsenal of companion planting, and that is to use shape masking plants. And shape masking plants again help with breaking uniformity in your garden, because uniformity is really what insects thrive on. So you have to get away from monocultures and really plant everything a little bit more chaotically, so that the shapes from one plant to the other are completely different. And you can work with trees, you can work with taller shrubs, but even in the small kind of, single herbaceous layer, there can be differences. Let me just walk you through a couple of examples in my garden to show you how I work with shape masking plants in my garden. So now we are approaching a small patch here where there is a Cape gooseberry, and on the bottom there is Chinese chives, and then behind it there is a kale, and then this trellis here grows up. There is Malabar spinach, there is beans. So different shapes, and especially the kales, which can be very susceptible to insect damage, they're being protected because they're kind of hidden away. Then here in this garden bed, which I recently started, there's potatoes that are coming up, and then there's lettuce, there's Chinese cabbage, there's some beans down here, there's more Chinese chives, and then there's even a lemon tree in the center. And again, you have these different shapes that make it difficult for insects to find what they're really looking for. You can see more examples of shape masking plants right here. There is a chili, there is a kale, there is a cauliflower, then there is the layer of pumpkin, there's more pigeon peas, there's another trellis here. So I think you're getting the idea of just working with a diversity of shapes, because uniformity is what insects thrive on. And if you can break up that so common pattern of uniformity in your own garden and work with trees like the moringa tree here, and with shrubs like even that comfrey, that artichoke, and then in between those you work with your productive plants, it really, really helps keeping insect pressures down in your garden. The third strategy is to work with what is called trap plants. And trap plants are plants that you don't really mind being eaten by insects if that protects your productive, valuable crops that you actually want to eat. So they're kind of sacrificial plants, and they're plants that you don't mind being eaten because you do want to provide food for insects. Because if you have that aim of eradicating all insects in your garden, you're going to suffer, because it's not natural, it's not what we are striving for. Because what we are striving for is an ecological balance, So we need to also provide food for insects, because otherwise you're always going to fight the insects, and you don't want to fight the insects, you actually want to work with the insects. So give them food that they like. So the best strategy that I've found is to really just start with your gardening journey, or already, maybe you're many years into your gardening journey, and just observe what is being eaten typically in your garden, because I can't really tell you, if you live somewhere in the US, or if you live somewhere in, let's say, Australia or China, I don't know where you're watching, what are the insects that are in your garden that cause you headache. But what you can do is to go out there every day and to observe what is being eaten in my garden, and what are the kind of plants that are being eaten that I don't actually mind being eaten, so that you can plant more of those, providing foods for insects. And those plants will be the trap plants that work in your particular garden. So let me walk you again through my garden and just share with you some observations from just the last couple of days of plants that can serve as trap plants in my particular situation. So right here I have a certain tree that is growing, and I don't even know the name of the tree. Basically it came up on its own and it's growing on its own, but you can see that the leaves here are being eaten by something. And the funny thing is that I don't really mind this being eaten. So this is an example of a trap plant that I could bring in more into the edges of the garden, into areas where anyways don't want to grow, and they can help with keeping insect damage down to the plants that I actually want to cultivate. Now here I have another example. This is the Chinese cabbage, and Chinese cabbage is something that a lot of insects in my garden, they quite like. But honestly, first of all, there is a lot of it. I'm growing it in many different patches, so I don't really mind them being eaten. So that's another consideration you could have. You could actually have crops that are considered valuable crops, let's say a cabbage, but you just choose to grow so many of them that you'll only lose 10, 20, 30%. And that in the big picture, in the big scheme of things, doesn't really matter. Now here's a famous example of a crop that is also considered a trap crop, a trap plant, and that's nasturtium. This plant here is nasturtium. And nasturtium is also eaten by some insects. Again, it depends on your locality. It depends on where you live. What are the insects that eat the nasturtium leaves? But nasturtium is very easy to grow. It's quite healthy, so you can eat it, but the insects also find it probably quite healthy. It's very resilient, so it doesn't really mind being eaten because the root system is quite vigorous, strong. It roots very easily, so you won't really be able to kill a nasturtium through having insects eating it. It makes a very good scent masking plant as well, because the scent is quite strong, but still there's some insects that like it. And anyways, it's one of the examples that you can try to work with. But my main advice on this third strategy of working with trap plants is really to go around your garden and see what are the kind of things that insects like, and just choose to cultivate more of those so that you can protect, through that simple strategy, some of your other valuable crops. Now the fourth strategy is kind of a wrap-up strategy, but it really kind of encompasses all the elements that I've talked about and more. And also, for example, in this video I already share some of it. It's really like a philosophy of gardening that simply says try to increase diversity as much as possible in your garden. Because if you manage to increase diversity, you break uniformity, and you basically work with the natural order of things, meaning there will be also a natural balance. If you have a natural balance of insects, of birds, of frogs, of spiders, of any kind of wildlife, including insects, including the soil life, you'll have a healthy balance, you'll have a healthy ecosystem. And the fundamental point to remember is that nature fundamentally cooperates and fundamentally keeps a balance. So there won't be 100% crop lost in a kind of situation where you have an ecological balance. Now check out my garden. There's many things to say in my garden and to talk about, but the number one thing that I would say is very easy to observe is that there is a great diversity of life. There is a diversity of the different shapes. So you have trees, you have shrubs, you are kind of approaching that food forest way of working, where you have the different layers, the 7 different layers. But then you also have a diversity of plants. So every garden bed has 5 or 10 or 15 different plants. And you have the idea of improving soil life continuously by using mulch, by using compost, by doing chop and drop, and all of these strategies that are part of ecological gardening. And overall, you create habitat for birds, for insects, for frogs, and the rest. And you increase ecological balance. And that is why in my own garden, I don't really have the kind of insect pressures that are so typical of kitchen gardens. Because I don't work with monocultures. I do a lot of interplanting, I do polycultures, I do plant spacing in a way that no one plant, is grown exclusively in one area, but I have, one cabbage here, one cauliflower there, in between I have a trap plant or a scent masking plant, and all of the different strategies that I've mentioned in the beginning of the video. And that really is, the fundamental idea of deterring pests naturally, is to create that balanced ecosystem. And of course, if you do have a problem in your garden, you may have to then start thinking about, okay, organic solutions, maybe, make some ferment some solution, or you do spraying of garlic or neem oil, or all of these things that are out there, and you can experiment with that. But before you go there, I would say try to implement the kind of stuff that I've been talking about in this video. Let me know how it goes, and thanks for watching. Consider subscribing and take good care of yourself.